Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks. My name is David Lee, and I'm actually I'm a founder of Intervention Services and Sober Solutions. My primary focus is drug and alcohol interventions. We're also a treatment referral network or agency. And most of the time I speak about interventions in family systems and things like that. This is a bit different. I did this last year at the Freedom and Recovery, and it's entitled Bronze Star, Purple Heart, or the Collateral Damage of Growing Up with Vietnam. And there's two areas of my life, or two things that have really impacted my life more than anything. And the first is addiction and recovery. My family is recovering alcoholics, things like that. I'm in recovery myself. I struggled. I lived in San Diego, went to a lot of treatment centers here. So that's one thing, and I'm not really going to talk too much about that. But the second thing that has impacted me more than anything else is Vietnam. I'm not a Vietnam veteran. My father was. My father was awarded the Bronze Star and a few Purple Hearts. He was a combat infantryman, and it probably impacted my life more than anything. And it's strange to say that, because if you walked into my house when I was growing up, Vietnam did not exist in my house. Absolutely not. My father refused to speak of it for probably 40 or 50 years. When I was a little kid, I would kind of explore in his room, and I'd find a little box of medals tucked away, or a uniform hung up. And I would try to engage with my father and try to, emotionally, he was very emotionally shut off, and I would try to connect with him. And when I was a little kid, I would build little models. And in the basement, I built a kind of a big diorama. It was on a big ping pong table. And it was my attempt at doing a big Vietnam reenactment scene. And it's kind of funny because I'm pretty sure I had like a World War II tank and like a plane and little dudes, probably some Civil War guys on there. I'm not really sure. And I kind of built this for him to kind of connect, because I would ask him questions, and my dad looked at this model and just kind of shrugged, and that was pretty much about it. So I would ask questions, and I was 10 or 11. I didn't understand politics. I didn't understand the unpopularity of the war. And in my eyes, if you go to the war, you're a hero. And there were a lot of things that I didn't understand until I started this presentation about 2 or 3 years ago, which is when my dad started to open up. This presentation is as a result of about 100 hours of interviews with men that he served with himself, and other people that were around during what was a singular event, a majorly traumatic event that occurred in Vietnam that changed the lives of a lot of different people. And up until the last 2 or 3 years, I didn't understand why it was that my father didn't speak about Vietnam at all. I didn't understand until a few years ago why on every December 16th, my father disappeared. He didn't go to work, didn't pick us up, he disappeared. He would sink into a deep depression for a few days before and a few days after, but I never understood why for 50 years my father disappeared on December 16th. I didn't understand why his medals until recently were tucked away in a small corner, out of sight. I didn't understand why he threw his military uniform away. I didn't understand many things until the last couple years when I started this process. It is an absolute honor to do this. The men that I talk to, if I could dedicate this to anybody, it would be to the men and women who have served in the military, as well as the family members who have kind of borne a lot of that. A lot of the topic of this is PTSD, and PTSD affects people in different ways. There's the explosive reacting, there's the flashbacks and the common things, but more commonly there's the isolation, the disconnection, the guy who sits in the corner and doesn't engage and doesn't communicate and has trouble making relationships, and that was my dad. So it is an absolute honor. The gentlemen that I've talked to, the veterans that I talked to, were all combat infantrymen. And what surprised me was how open they were to talk to me. If I had tried to do this 30 years ago, well, I would have been 12, so they probably wouldn't have talked to me then. But if I was a little bit older, they probably wouldn't have been capable of it, as my father wasn't. But they opened up to me, and they were absolutely open and honest about every single thing. They would tell me everything. Every single detail. There was one question that I never asked any of them, and it was a question that I wanted to ask my dad when I was 10. I never did, and it was, how many people did you kill? And I could have asked any of them that question, the question of a 10-year-old, And I chose not to because I knew that the answer was probably going to be a lot. And it wasn't because I was afraid of the number. It's because I knew if I asked them, they would answer in a very matter-of-fact way, as if I had asked them what did they have for breakfast. And the way they would have answered probably would have concerned me quite a bit. And I didn't want my dad to have to say that in a matter-of-fact way. So again, the title of this is Bronze Star, Purple Heart, the collateral damage of growing up with Vietnam. I grew up essentially with Vietnam. It was an invisible thing that existed, but this is for the men and women who also grew up with Vietnam. And I have to admit, this is a very intimidating room. I didn't know if I was going to run out of the curtain or anything like that. My fiance said, "Don't worry, did you know that Nixon gave a state dinner here for..." I'm like, "Yeah, thank you. That makes me feel even better." So, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and get started a little bit. This isn't really a clinical. When I approached many of these men, I went over a lot of the clinical side of things. I didn't approach this as a counselor or therapist. That wasn't my job or my role. But I did talk to them. Many of them have never been in therapy or anything like that. And I talked to them about the DSM, the criteria. I talked to them about the symptoms. I talked to them about the recovery things. And we would just really talk. And they were open about absolutely everything. So I will talk in the beginning about some of the clinical side of things. But again, I didn't approach this from a clinical perspective. I really wanted to pursue it as a human story because it's human beings. These gentlemen were 18, 19, 20 years old. And nothing that they learned in basic training prepared them for what they ran into. Absolutely nothing. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to talk a little bit about PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. There are basically three different types of PTSD, but there's only one of which is recognized by the DSM. The first is the most common, and it's PTSD. And basically, it's a severe anxiety disorder that can develop after exposure to an event that results in psychological trauma. And essentially, if something traumatic happens to you, most of us have traumatic things that happen to us. We get distressed as a result of it. PTSD is somewhat different. This is when we feel that our life is in jeopardy or our physical or mental or spiritual well-being is in such trauma or such jeopardy that it affects us. And one of the main criteria for being diagnosed with PTSD is that the symptoms last for more than 30 days. Many of us, or many people, many common people that don't enter into the military suffer from PTSD. Women that have been victimized or traumatized, they can suffer from PTSD. It wasn't until after Vietnam that PTSD actually became recognized. I think what they're saying now is people in the military today, I think 1 in 5 are being diagnosed with PTSD coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan and things like that. So it's actually, there's been a shift into more recognition. Almost all of the guys that I spoke to denied, absolutely denied, and the last thing in the world that they ever wanted to do was to walk into a VA and to try to claim veterans benefits, to try to claim PTSD. The majority of them absolutely denied it. An interesting thing that I discovered in some of my research is that Vietnam veterans, ironically, have a lower unemployment rate than other people of their same age bracket that did not go to Vietnam. And I assumed it would be the opposite. I assumed they were all be train wrecks. And in everybody that I talked to, there was alcoholism in every case. There was major relationship problems. There was all kinds of problems. But ironically, in terms of their work ethic, they all had great jobs. Outwardly, if you were to look at my father, you would say that he did a perfect job. Wife, 2 kids, house, great work ethic, etc. All of them appeared outwardly to be fine. And one of the biggest mantras that I heard over and over in talking to these guys is that they were fine. They were fine. They were fine in the middle of combat. They were fine after Vietnam. They were fine when their wives left. They were fine when they got a job. They were fine if their children died. They were fine, fine, fine. So post-traumatic stress disorder was actually becoming more recognized. It's no longer a social stigma. There was a bit of animosity and things with a lot of the veterans of back then compared to some of the veterans today, because it was the last thing in the world that they wanted to do. And even today, I talked to, some of the people I talked to was a clinical psychologist who oversees the veterans at Hazelden, who served with my father. And a lot of different people. I talked to professionals, and they said, interestingly, even today, that those that see the most traumatic events are the least likely to try to pursue benefits and to talk to the VA. And those that usually see the least are the quickest. So it creates this weird disparity, which means that there are a large number of people that maybe didn't see a lot of combat, and the people that really, really need it, just like in Vietnam, are the ones that are quote-unquote fine. The next thing is complex PTSD. Complex PTSD isn't actually recognized by the DSM. However, it to me actually fits more with the Vietnam veterans that I spoke to. Complex PTSD is usually a singular event, one or two events that occur that create such major traumatic, create stress, psychological distress. Complex PTSD is a series of things. So whereas perhaps, let's say you're a female that had been assaulted or raped, that could create PTSD, but let's think of a child, or let's think of molestation, where it's over and over and over and over and over and over again. The Vietnam veterans that I talked to, what was really most interesting is that they thought, or that I thought, that it was the gunfight, the war, the blowing up that was the most traumatic events for them. And what we're going to talk about is a singular, majorly traumatic event. But ironically, most of them said, you have to understand that it wasn't the firing, it wasn't the gunfire that created the most distress, it was the in-between time. There's a study that talks about the number of days in combat that a combat infantryman would do in Vietnam, 240 days in a year. They would do a tour, and about 240 days was the average that they would see combat. And when I talked to all of them about it, they always laughed. And they said, really, combat? What do you define as combat? And they said, did you consider 3 straight days? Does that count as 3 days? Or do you consider when a guy shoots one time, is that 1 day? Or what about when we didn't see anybody and somebody stepped on a mine? Does that count as a day? And it's interesting because when I would talk more clinical or statistics, they reminded me that we're talking about human beings. We're talking about real life events. These are not statistics. So they would always laugh. 200, that doesn't mean anything to them. They always responded, you don't understand. We were in combat 365 days a year. And the worst part of it was not when we were pulling our trigger. It was the minute before, it was the hour before. Sometimes we didn't see anything, and that was the worst. So complex PTSD is when it's over and over and over again. And then there's a new thing that's called continuous post-traumatic stress disorder. Continuous is if you are raised, for example, in war-torn regions such as Bosnia, if you are literally raised in that, everything that you know, there are some studies that are kind of showing that if you think of people in inner-city gangland areas, they are raised in it. This isn't 1 or 2 years of events. This is always. Every waking moment of your life from when you're born until today is continual trauma after trauma after trauma. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 5 stages of PTSD recovery. First is the first event. It's called the emergency or outcry stage. Victims' responses are very intense and run at high levels, where they feel the fight or flight response come over them when faced with a life-threatening situation. What was interesting to me in talking to a lot of them is things were never black and white in Vietnam. There were many times where they were faced with a situation where option A, you lost, and option B, you lost. There was no option C. So it created a lot of moral conflicts, things like that. These feelings can last as long as the victim feels the situation is still present. They can display physical signs, rapid breathing, rapid pulse, elevated blood pressure. Essentially, this is the event. So the event occurs and there's a period afterwards. This is the beginning. Next phase is emotional numbing and denial phase. Basically, this is when they deny the emotions and try to forget. For my father, this phase probably lasted roughly 30 years. Vietnam absolutely did not exist. For most of the guys that I talked to, it was roughly 20 to 30 years. Some of the gentlemen that I talked to did get into recovery, 12-step recovery, and actually it actually helped to bump them from this stage into the next ones. But the emotional numbing or denying, I'll give you an example. My father, when he came out of Vietnam, he did 2 tours, one in Korea and one in Vietnam. At his job, when people would ask him about being in the military, he always lied and said that he went to Korea. It wasn't that he was ashamed, it's just that he would not, Vietnam no longer existed. I was in Korea. Third phase is intrusive repetitive phase. This is when they start to have nightmares, volatile mood swings, and intrusive images, higher startle responses. About 2/3 of the people that I talked to did have this. Some people did not have the nightmares. Some people did not have the flashbacks. Fourth phase is reflective or transition. The majority of the people that I talked to, with the exception of one, in the last 10 years, they've entered into this phase where the healing is really starting to begin. Now understand that today, I believe when you're diagnosed, a lot of the guys that are coming out of the military, they're almost immediately swooped into to see a therapist to try to process. Whether they engage with that therapist or not is up to them, but they actually almost immediately will kind of have that happen. In Vietnam, there was none of that. There were no process groups, there was no tell me about how you feel, there was absolutely none of that. And when we start to talk about a day in the life of a combat infantryman, it's pretty amazing how they dealt with it, or more importantly, how they didn't deal with it. Final stage is integration phase, and in this final stage, the survivors succeeded in overcoming the trauma and past experiences. They've gone into a stage of acceptance. They can move on with their lives. They see it as it really is. They see it more objectively. It's a part of them, but it isn't. They're not necessarily chained to it. I went over each of these things. This is the DSM criteria for PTSD. It was really kind of interesting because, again, I didn't approach it from a clinical standpoint, but as I sat with these guys, I said, do you want to know what they say? And we're going to kind of go over each of these, and we'll talk about it at various stages of your life. And we're going to go through this. Basically, the diagnostic criteria, you need 2 criteria and symptoms from each of the 3 symptom clusters. So the first is the stressor. Okay, criterion A is a stressor. You have to have had experienced, witnessed, or been confronted with an event or events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of oneself or others. And again, what was ironic about a lot of these guys is the majority of the psychological trauma that they experienced wasn't necessarily when their buddy blew up. It was the hours, it was the night patrols, it was those kind of things, which I'll get into in a little bit. The second is a person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror, and in children it could be expressed instead by disorganized or agitated behavior. So in other words, there's a reaction to that. Criterion B, intrusive recollection. Traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in at least one of the following areas. 1, recurrent or intrusive distressing recollections of the event, including images, thoughts, or perceptions. Everyone that I talked to said that they think of Vietnam every single day. And what's interesting is that those that were drafted generally did 1-year tour of Vietnam. 1 year, back in the 60s, 70s. And as a result of that, for every day for 50 years, they thought about that 1 year. Every day. So, number 2 is recurrent distressing dreams of the event. About 2/3 of the people that I talked to had recurring dreams. One gentleman had the same exact dream every single night for 20 years until he got into recovery, and then he went back over to Vietnam and he had the same dream. He went to visit Vietnam, and I'll talk about that at the end here. Number 3, acting or feeling as if the traumatic event were recurring includes a sense of reliving the experience, illusions, hallucinations, dissociative flashback episodes, including those that occur upon awakening or when intoxicated. It's interesting because, for example, my father, a lot of people don't remember a flashback. They didn't really kind of remember. My father, when I talked to him, I didn't have any flashbacks. And in talking to my uncle, he said, oh, well, let me tell you. And it was when my father first got back from Vietnam. They were downstairs drinking and having a little bit of a party. And my father got up to leave the party, and he said, I'm going to leave. And he lived a few houses down, and he left. It was probably about 10 o'clock at night. 2 hours goes by, and my uncle went to take the garbage out, and my father apparently had been hiding for the last 2 hours in the dark behind the garbage bins, waiting for the Viet Cong. And when my uncle came to throw the garbage away, my father pounced on him and threw him up against the wall and was going to kill my uncle. And my father said when he looked into his eyes, he realized that my father was not there. He was in Vietnam, and it was the scariest experience of his life. My father doesn't remember this, kind of denies it a little bit. My uncle remembers it very vividly. My uncle probably has PTSD as a result of that now. So another interesting thing, I'm in recovery. I lived, I struggled and things like that. There was a period where I was off and on the streets of San Diego. And there was a period I was wandering around near the shelters and things like that. And, when you're kind of a homeless guy, you don't you walk a lot, you know, and I'm walking around, and there was an older gentleman who had army fatigues on and things like that, and he asked to bum a smoke, and I said sure, and we were just walking for about an hour, and it was during I think it was one of the Persian Gulf, maybe the first thing with Saddam and all that stuff, and he was just bitching about the war and the president and how we shouldn't be over there and all that stuff. An hour goes by, and he's just going on, and after about an hour, he's like, "In that damn Nixon." And I realized that for an hour, he had been talking about 1960-something. He was not in present day. And just as matter of fact as you can be, he coexisted rather well, but he was not here. The fourth is intense psychological distress and exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. And what's really interesting is that some triggers you can kind of identify, some you can't. Smells can trigger things. Sights, sounds, that kind of thing. I remember once my father asked me to go to see the movie Platoon, which I thought was his way of reaching out. He didn't talk about it, but he had heard that it was a pretty close proximity to what it was like, and he went there, and as a result of that, he kind of spun out a little bit after that. So it was visual cues, things like that. What's really interesting about all the guys that I talked to is, for some strange reason, almost all of them live apart from society, and they seem very, very comfortable in the woods. Right now, as we're talking right now, my father is building a hiking trail for the little town he lives in the woods. He's got a little, like a hoe, and he's the weird guy in town who's building a hiking trail for the town, and that's where he's at right now. He was there yesterday all day. He is very, very comfortable in the woods, all by himself, all alone. And I was always like, wouldn't that kind of bring things back? You're, you know, in the jungle, and I guess our woods and their jungle are a lot different. If they looked the same, it would probably be somewhat different. I don't think there'd be a comfort zone. But all of them live a little bit away, all of them. The clinical psychologist in Hazelden lives off the beaten path. My father lives on a private lake. Most of the people live away in a shack in the woods, just a little bit removed from society. 5, physiological reactivity upon exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect. In other words, there's a physical or physiological reaction to it. Heart rate, increased heart rate, those kind of things, sweating. Criterion C is avoiding and numbing. Number 1, efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. Again, for the majority of the people that I spoke with, Vietnam no longer existed after Vietnam. It was very frustrating for many of the people because, for example, my father would wander into a bar. He was an active alcoholic back then. And he would sit there, and always at the corner of the bar, there would be a guy sitting there with the 2 beautiful women talking about all his wonderful experiences in Vietnam and all this stuff and all the bravado and things like that. And my father said, and everybody that I talked to said, that they can tell who was not in combat over there. And it was frustrating because those that saw the most combat didn't talk about it. Those that really didn't see much combat were usually the ones bragging about it and all that stuff. So it's kind of that weird disconnection. My father, you know, in sociology or anthropology, they talk about a concept that's called the stranger. And what it is that if I, as an American citizen, go and I'm going to immerse myself in the jungles of Africa and hang out with a tribe for a year, I will adopt some of their characteristics of that culture, and I will no longer be officially, culturally, a full American citizen. I will not be a full African tribes member culturally. I'm going to be a blend of both. I will be what is referred to as a stranger. I'm a blend of both. I'm a ghost. I no longer fully fit in on either. Most of the Vietnam veterans experienced this. They were strangers. They were ghosts. They didn't fully fit in back there. They didn't fully fit in here. They didn't really fit in much of anywhere. But they were really, really good at projecting an illusion that everything was fine. They got jobs, got wives, because that's what they were supposed to do, those kind of things. Number 2, efforts to avoid activities, places, or people that arouse recollections of the trauma. Again, for most of them, Vietnam didn't exist. They just avoided instinctively. 3, inability to recall an important aspect of the trauma. Most of the guys that I talked to had such vivid recall now. And here it is 50 years later. If I had talked to them 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it would have been vague, it would have been blurred. They would have protected themselves from revisiting those things. 4, markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities. Again, my father to this day, if we had like a family reunion, he may or may not come. If he does, he comes late, he leaves early, he sits off or away. My father could never show up here. He could never be at a conference or anything like that. There's no way. And it wouldn't be like he'd freak out. He just wouldn't. It's just not really his thing. Number 5, a feeling of detachment or estrangement from others. Talking to a lot of the wives and spouses, there was a great frustration because they married these gentlemen, and yet there was an emotional disconnection. They were absolutely loners. And every single person that I talked to, there was an aspect of their emotions that permanently changed. They were absolutely disconnected in a way, and I'll talk about that at the end. 6, restricted range of affect, unable to have loving feelings. 7, a sense of foreshortened future. Most of the people that I talked to couldn't really relate to that, but here we are. A lot of them are kind of in the healing process, things like that. I didn't have the opportunity to talk to them when they were in their 20s or 30s. Did they have that attitude? Well, in listening to their lives and their kind of gung-ho, who cares, carefree, alcoholic, drug, doesn't matter, what's the worst that could happen, when I heard their adventures after Vietnam, it seems to me like they had that idea. You only live once, you only live for today, forget about tomorrow. Hyperarousal. Number 1, difficulty falling or staying asleep. Many of them suffered from this. 2, irritability or outbursts of anger. Major mood swings, major outbursts of anger, violent anger. Some of the people I spoke with had major OCD. This is the way things are, and if you don't put your toys away, explosion. And the kids learn to kind of dance around Dad. And the sad thing about it is that it wasn't necessarily predictable outbursts of anger, it was random outbursts of anger. You never knew, and you learn to kind of tiptoe. And if Dad has a good day, it's a good day. And if Dad has a bad day, it's a really bad day. Difficulty concentrating. 4 is hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is really kind of interesting. Hypervigilance, there's one gentleman that for many years would, he lived kind of off the beaten path, and every night he would be in the kitchen with the lights off, looking in the backyard at the tree line for them. And if you look hard enough, you can see in the shadows something. And his heart rate and his adrenaline's going, and he just knows. And he's connecting unrelated events, somewhat conspiratorial. He just knows. Something isn't right. There's a feeling in the air. Perhaps the humidity that day was the same as what it was in Vietnam. Perhaps it was a scent. Perhaps it was a cricket. Who knows what it was, but for 6 hours, there he would be, looking for them. 5, exaggerated startle response. You know, a lot of times, you know, a backfire of an engine, those kind of things. The duration, criterion E, the duration of the disturbance is more than 1 month. And criterion F is really interesting. Functional significance. The disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Those that did eventually reach out to try to talk to the VA about PTSD and the things that they had gone through, almost all of them were denied immediately because they had jobs, they didn't go to treatment. Even though they were acute alcoholic, they didn't go to treatment, they didn't have a clinical sheet, they didn't have any of that stuff. My father once joked to me, he said, David, if you walked into the VA, you would immediately get 100% coverage in your benefits because I had been to treatment many times, I'd seen therapists. I've got the good thing to show up. And in my father's case, that wasn't so. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about a day in the life of the combat infantrymen in Vietnam, and this is as they explained it to me. The area that we're going to talk about is in South Vietnam. It's down there. It's a little blurry here, but it's called the Iron Triangle, and down there in the Iron Triangle there were tunnels. It was right outside of Saigon, and basically my father was also a tunnel rat. He was skinny and little, or I'm not skinny anymore, but he was little like I was. and he would go down in tunnels and things like that. There were traps, punji sticks. They would set up little traps, little booby traps, things like that. And that was the area. And essentially, basically, what's really interesting is, again, is that nothing prepared them in basic training or advanced training to what they experienced. So basically, all of you guys, they could teach in about a day. And it's not to demean the service or demean the basic, the training or anything like that. But basically, as my father said, is We learned more day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4 than anything they prepared us for. And essentially, if you arrived in Vietnam, again, if you were drafted, as most of the people that I talked to were, you would do 2 tours, one of which probably would be in Vietnam, the other maybe somewhere else. And when you landed in Vietnam, everybody that I talked to said the first thing they remember about Vietnam was the heat and the humidity. That they opened the doors of the helicopter to the plane and they got hit by just a wave of heat and humidity. Every single one, I always said, what's the first thing you remember? They said the heat and the humidity, like a wall that hit us. And basically you would arrive at a base and you would get a little bit of kind of refresher training and that kind of thing. And what would happen is that you would then get into a helicopter and you would actually fly into a central area out in the middle of nowhere. And I'm going to kind of describe this and talk about this because it's kind of fascinating. I didn't understand a lot of the day-to-day military life that they did in Vietnam. I always assumed you're kind of at a base and you kind of go out and do this and come back to the base and things like that. My dad said, no, we weren't really at the main base. We were always out in the woods. We were always out there. In the 365 days that my father did, he said he spent 2 days, I think, back at the main base. The majority of the rest of it was all out there in the woods. And they actually liked it that way. There was a real big, a statistic that I didn't know is that in Vietnam, I assumed if you went to Vietnam, you probably fought in Vietnam. And he said, no, only about 1 in 10 of the people that served in Vietnam actually fought in Vietnam. Which means for every one of those guys on the ground, there were 9 people in the back, and they were doing all kinds of different things. So the rare occasions my father would be at the main base, there's officers and things like that that didn't actually see any combat, and there was a lot of resentment. The officers looked down on the grunts and the infantrymen and kind of felt they were kind of those guys, and the infantrymen looked down on the officers and things like that at the base because they had never really seen any combat. So it was kind of that. Another interesting statistic, that, in World War II, if I'm not mistaken, the number of combat days that somebody saw in the European theater, I think was about 100 to 150. Vietnam, it was 240. The number about World War II is a little bit misleading because they say that the reason it was so low is because a lot of people died before they hit the 150th day. That the attrition rate was very, very high. In World War II in the Pacific theater, during the islands and things like that, the average combat days was 40 in a tour, 40 in a year. And the reason that it's so much higher in Vietnam, and the reason it's very, very high in Iraq and Afghanistan is because of helicopters. World War II, the front is over here. It's going to take you a few days to get there. You're going to have to walk. You're going to have to drive. Helicopters changed the face of everything. You can literally get on a helicopter and plop somebody right on there, and they can have combat. And then you can plop somebody over here, and they can literally fight every day, every other day, every other day, and that's how you win a war. My father said about every other day, 2 to 3 times a week, they saw combat, which means somebody was trying to shoot at them every 2 to 3 days. And the drawing that I've drawn here, because I couldn't find an aerial picture anywhere. I couldn't find anything that would describe what it is. My father was a member of the mechanized infantry, which basically means that they were all in armored personnel carriers. And there were about 16 of them. And how it was designed that way is if you look at that circle, the little squares all the way around there, it's bigger than this room. But essentially, if you arrived in Vietnam, a helicopter would plop you down in the middle, and you would meet the commanding officer, and he would assign you to a squad. A squad is about 8 to 10 people, roughly, and they basically lived in a little APC. They didn't necessarily live there, but all their belongings were in there. An armored personnel carrier is like a big minivan, armored minivan, with a machine gun on the top and a door that opens in the back. Again, there's 16 to 20 of these all in a circle, and it's interesting because if you think of the Wild West days when they would round up the wagons, it was the same kind of thing. And basically, what it was 16 to 20 of these armored personnel carriers, and in the middle, there were a bunch of people that had mortars, and they would launch them out. And the purpose and the point of everything is that they would find a location, and they would circle up, and then they would send out basically patrols to look for the enemy, and they would spend a few days there, and they would pack everything up, and they'd drive again for a few miles. They didn't come back anywhere. They basically went from A to B to C to D, looking for the enemy. And in Vietnam, it was different because there were no fronts. And a lot of times, my father would say, we would hear that they were there, but we didn't know how many. There was an incident, and one of the people that I'm going to talk about, he and his company were out there, and there was about 67, I think, men, 67 or 87 men, and they were on a patrol, and they encountered 2,500 Viet Cong soldiers. 2,500. They lost, and lost a large number of men, but they didn't know there were 2,500. You don't know if there's 3, you don't know. You can hear based on the gunfire. Our soldiers shot M16s, they shot AK-47s, and the military back then, you could learn to differentiate between the gunfire. And you could hear if there's a lot of shooting here, if there's shooting here and there, it's kind of probably a large size. But there's no drones, there's not a lot of military intelligence. Over and over and over it was, there seems to be somewhere out here. And your job is to go and walk out there until they begin shooting at you. And when they begin shooting at you, you always lose 1 or 2, or some people get wounded, always. It's just the price. And you either keep going until they run away, or you kill them all, or you keep going until you back up. And then you regroup and you do it again and again. So basically, if any of you were to plop yourself into Vietnam, you'd be assigned to a squad. A squad is 8 people, roughly the number here. And when I asked him, is it 8, is it, because sometimes he would say 10, sometimes he would say 6. And he'd say, well, it could be 6 to 10. Technically, it's supposed to be about 8. And I said, well, how come it's 10? How come it's 6? And he said, well, if half your squad gets blown up, there's only 4 of you left. And in some cases, they take 2 of you and put you into this squad, and 2 of you and put you here. Or in other cases, they'd bring more people in. And if you landed in that middle of that thing and the commanding officer sent you to the squad leader, understand that you're probably taking the place of somebody that had either died or been wounded. It was interesting because when my dad would talk about war buddies, he would talk about this person, talk about events and things like that. And in talking to him, it was kind of confusing to me. And he said, you don't understand, we were all in rotation. He said, so if you were a member of a squad and you had 8 people, Joe over there may have been here for 10 months. He's leaving in 2. Steve over here, just got here. He may be here for the rest of your tour. But Bob, who's going to get killed tomorrow, he's gone. He's going to be replaced. And the interesting thing about war, at least war in Vietnam, is it is absolutely the worst relationship building situation on the planet, because you are immersed in very intense, intimate situations with people that tomorrow probably won't be there. And there is no processing of it. It's just they're gone. And one of the biggest impacts that I think happened to the guys that I talked to was that impaired sense of love, impaired sense of loss. They had a disconnection in terms of losing people. The interesting thing, and I'll get into this at the end, is if I died tomorrow, my father would not cry at my funeral. It's not because he doesn't care. He would say, I guess that's that. Probably go play golf. And in most of the men that I talked to, that's exactly the case. So basically, if you were a new guy, again, a day in the life of being a new guy there was, you would wake up about 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, and as soon as day broke, you would go out on a patrol. And a patrol or a sweep was generally about 50 or 60 different guys, and you would all get in a line, and there would be one person in the front. They would assign him as the point man, and his job was to kind of, well, flush those guys out. I asked my dad, isn't that kind of a crappy job? And he said, well, sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes I liked being alone. Sometimes I really didn't. And that guy, and they'd all just kind of walk, and they'd walk for miles and miles and miles, and they'd swoop back around and keep coming. And the point, again, is to keep walking until they shoot at you. And as soon as they shoot at you, you drop down and you engage the enemy. And depending on how big the enemy is, you could call for artillery. And artillery was really fascinating to me. Artillery is a bunch of big guns that are sitting way back miles away on the base, and they would call in coordinates, and these big guns would lob. This is the 60s. Today I understand it, but in the 60s, they would get the coordinates right and big explosions would happen. Or they would call in for plane support, which was napalm, and a big thing of flames would kind of come through. And that was the point, and every other day, this is what they did. There were some really, really crappy jobs in the military. There were no days off, absolutely no days off. If you lost all your buddies, you did not get a day off. There was absolutely no day off. One of the people of the squad would remain on top of the machine gun of the APC. So if you imagine this area here and imagine 16 armored personnel carriers in a circle, there's a person at the top of each of them all day. His job is to sit there from about 6 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, facing outwards on a machine gun, waiting for them to protect the perimeter. And his job was literally sit. I thought, what? He said, well, it wasn't a bad job. You know, you could kind of write, you know, have postcards and things like that, write home to your family and things like that. My father, as a result of being in Vietnam, looked at things differently. When he was in Vietnam, interestingly enough, you could write your family and they would send mail back to you and they'd plop it down on a helicopter. It's kind of neat. But he would always write to his parents and he would talk about, we had a great day, we killed 30 of them. It's the only way he could describe success or failure in his eyes. He was now a combat infantryman. And he'd write another letter, we had a bad day, we only killed 10 of them. And he thinks back on that, he thinks, what did his poor mother and father think of their 19 or 20-year-old son who reads a letter and basically says, we killed 30 of them, we killed 40. They didn't want to hear any of that. And that's basically the communication that they got. So basically, at night was probably the worst. At night, they had what were called night patrols. My father absolutely hated night patrols. Everyone that I talked to hated night patrols. And night patrols means you and about 9 other people are going to walk out in the dark, and you're going to go intentionally where the enemy is at night, as quietly as you can, about a mile or 2 out there. And then you're going to sit. You can't sleep, and you just wait for them to come, and then you begin to engage the enemy. My father absolutely hated night patrol. It was terrifying. Can you imagine walking through the jungles in the middle of the night? Like, could you see anything? It was full moon, you could. Sometimes not. The other crappy job was what's called the listening post. And the listening post was 3 guys would go out about 100 feet or 100 yards or so, and they would hide just outside the perimeter. And the point was, in case the enemy was creeping up on the perimeter, they would hear it. And almost everybody I talked to, they hated the listening post job. And I thought, well, that doesn't sound so bad. And they said, well, you got to understand, our job is to wait for them. And he goes, and sometimes it is not in our best interest to open fire. If there's 50 of them, you can or cannot. He said, but here's the worst part of it, is the middle of the night, you are here, the enemy is here, you are directly in between the perimeter and the enemy. So when you began to engage, all the machine gunners that have been camped out all night would begin to shoot at the enemy and you. People hated the listening post job. 7 days a week, this is pretty much what they did. They rotated in, they rotated out. There was a lot of trauma. A lot of people died, and it was just so interesting how matter of fact. I thought in talking about the deaths of their fellow members, that's when they would get the most emotional, and they didn't. So basically, again, you would meet a company commander. All of the pictures that I have, just through circumstance, it just so happened that Roger Smith was a photographer who happened to be out there. So all the pictures that I have are of the time that are surrounding a particular event in December. Just happened to be, this is a company commander standing in front of a village that's burning. He's the first person you would meet. He would assign you to a squad. These are armored personnel carriers. These were the ones that my dad was on and things like that. It's interesting because the only time my father ever cried was when he talked about when his armored personnel carrier got blown up. Not the people that got blown up, but when how he explained it is he said, you don't understand, that was my home. Because I lived in it for a year, all my things, my possessions, this was my home. And it was the only time that he began to cry when he talked about losing his home. Here's another kind of opening the back of an armored personnel carrier. These are some various things. This gentleman right in the back actually is carrying an RPG or a rocket launcher. This particular event, they were chasing some Viet Cong, and there was they chased him, and he actually had an RPG, and he caught him and had his gun to him, and the Viet Cong soldier gave himself up, surrendered. This gentleman shot him instead, which is against the rules of war, but that's just how things kind of were. And he brought back as a souvenir this RPG. And my father would talk about things like that, about the rules and things like that. And I brought up a time where I talked about there was, you know, with some of the soldiers urinating on corpses and things like that. And my father said, you have to understand something. He said, the primary focus for the military was to dehumanize the enemy. And the more dehumanized you could make them, the more effective we were. And there's actually an interesting study that they did, the military did, and they showed that if you were engaged with an enemy that wore masks over their faces, your accuracy improved like 5-fold. You are much better attacking an enemy that has masks on, turbans, those kind of things. And the more human your enemy looks, you will instinctively misfire. Human beings instinctively don't necessarily want to kill other human beings. You get over it real quick when they start shooting at you, but initially you will instinctively kind of pull away. And part of the military's job was to dehumanize. So some of these things that happened, they didn't happen to people. Sherman didn't kill a person for a souvenir or an RPG. It was a dehumanized Viet Cong soldier. Another thing that was very interesting is that there were a lot of Vietnamese people that were a part of their base. One of the things that they talked about is don't trust anybody, especially don't trust the Vietnamese. And yet in every base, as guides, as dishwashers, et cetera, there were South Vietnamese people everywhere. So it was kind of confusing. It was, they dehumanized the enemy, but there was kind of one there, even though he's kind of on a different side. So it was just an awkward place to be. Here's a couple more guys here. These pictures here are some more military pictures. This is some of them that are actually driving. Again, you would stay for a few days, and then you'd kind of go out somewhere, and you'd pick a relative field, and then you would start again. Here's a point man. He's actually standing a little close to that tank there. My father was a point man next to a tank once, and an RPG shot at the tank and hit the light that was on the end of the tank. The RPG landed here and didn't go off. The tank responded by firing and blew my father's hearing out. He didn't get a Purple Heart for that. He didn't get a Purple Heart for a lot of things, but he lost his hearing. He has no hearing out of that side. He said that day he heard a ringing and he's never stopped hearing it. So, hold up, this is people getting ready to go on a patrol. This is the new guy. No one likes the new guy. The new guy doesn't understand. The new guy has not been changed yet. The new guy instinctively will not fire back as soon as he's fired upon. He'll pause. He's scared. He makes a lot of stupid mistakes. I'll give you kind of a story that my father told me about a gentleman by the name of Cardenas. Cardenas was a new guy. He showed up. He'd been there about a day or so, and they went out on a patrol, on a sweep, and the enemy started shooting, and they dropped back down underneath a little dinky hill. And my father looked at Cardenas. Cardenas was new. It's his first experience, and he is shaking like this. He is so scared because bullets are flying overhead. It's his very first time. My father looks at him. He looks at him shaking, and my father had been through it for 6 months or whatever have you. And he reached into his pocket, and he pulled out a cigarette. My father lit up a cigarette. And Cardenas looked at him like, he goes, are you nuts? And my father looked at him in just a way to kind of reassure him that everything will be okay. Because in Vietnam, in situations like that, you can't say everything will be okay. So there are a million little tricks that the soldiers learn to give each other comfort, to train the new guy. And Cardenas actually stopped shaking, and he got a little bit more relaxed. And a few months later, Cardenas, sitting next to a new guy in his first firefight, probably lit up a cigarette and looked at that guy as if to say that everything will be okay. An interesting story about Cardenas. Cardenas had about 6 months after he had been there, they were on a sweep and they became overrun. Overrun means they're outnumbered, the enemy is coming and they're swarming and there's just too many and you've got to kind of run away. And they got overrun, and he was there with his buddy, and his buddy had gotten shot up pretty bad, and there they were sitting by a tree, and his buddy was bleeding and bleeding out, and they were starting to get overrun. In Vietnam, there are no black and white decisions, and sometimes option A, you lose, and option B, you lose. Cardenas can either stay with his bleeding, dying buddy and get captured or killed himself, or he can leave. Cardenas chose to leave, and he ran, leaving his buddy to die or be captured. And as he ran away, he too became overrun. And the Viet Cong were surrounding him. Cardenas was a devout Catholic, and as he was running, he knew that he couldn't escape, and he could hear all the gunfire and the boots and everything around him. So he fell to his knees, and he sat there with his eyes closed, and he threw his gun, his weapon on the ground, and he began to pray. And being Catholic, he probably did, "Our Father." And as he describes it, he would say, you know, "Our Father who art in heaven," with his eyes closed, and he could hear the boots coming closer. You know, "Hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done." And he could hear him 10 feet away, 5 feet away, and earth is in heaven. And he's praying and he's crying and he's praying. And he feels the muzzle of an AK-47 on the back of his head, and it knocks his helmet off. And it pushes his head forward. And he begins to pray more and more. And a second time he feels the muzzle push His head goes further. And the third time, he feels a muzzle. And he's praying, and he's praying, and he's praying, deliver us from evil. Forgive us our trespasses. We forgive those who trespass against us. And then for some strange reason, the Viet Cong that were surrounding him, that had the gun to his head, turned around and walked away. Maybe they were Christian, maybe not. Cardenas went back to, and made it back to the little perimeter, and told this story, and half the people couldn't believe it, and half the people could, and they told him how lucky he was. He had just walked away from his buddy and left him to die against a tree. And a little piece of Cardenas was left in Vietnam that day, and Cardenas spent the next 40 or 50 years lucky, racked with the guilt. Option A or option B, did I make the right decision? Why was I saved? Why was I not? And everyone said, oh, what a great thing it was. Cardenas did not look at it that way. Why did God save me? To punish me? To haunt me with the guilt that I should have stayed with my friend? And the rational thing is he should have left. The rational thing, if he had stayed, he would have probably died. But that was Cardenas, the new guy. Jungle sweep, here they are. Looks like a real fun place to go, middle of the night, those kind of things. Here's an armored ambulance. This is a tank, basically, with a wounded soldier on it. There's a minesweeper looking for mines. I asked him, I go, were you really that nervous about mines? Not really. We're kind of more afraid of them shooting at us and that kind of stuff. Waiting for dust off. This is somebody waiting for a helicopter. Helicopters came in and removed wounded. They came in and dropped people off. Bulldozing with bullets. Basically, that's a day in the life of a combat infantryman, and I'm going to talk about basically an event that occurred on December 16th where 6 people in a squad were all erased in a flash, and how it affected the survivors and how it affected all the people and their lives afterwards. This gentleman here is Dr. Don Elbert. Don is a clinical psychologist at Hazelden. He served with my father. He actually oversees the veterans and the PTSD program over there. I had met him a couple times when I was a kid, and he would tell me stories about my dad, about, hey, your dad's a hero because of this or that, and I didn't really understand. I was a little kid. My dad wouldn't talk about those kind of things. But what's interesting is the first picture to the left, this is actually Don when he first got there, kind of a young kid. And this is Don about a month or two later. And if you look at him, the picture, it's a little bit grainy that you guys can see. It looks like he's aged about 20 years. And that's the price of being in Vietnam. By then, Don had changed. So we're going to talk about December 16th, 1967, and it's ironic that there happened to be a photographer out there during this whole thing. Basically, this is the photographer, Roger Smith. He was just following him around, taking pictures of everything. And this is the morning of the event. This is my father actually behind the guy that's pointing. Basically, my father and another gentleman, Sergeant Cahey, had gone out on a sweep. They knew that there was a lot of enemy activity. They'd gone out on a sweep, and apparently, unbeknownst to my father, they drew the enemy back in. Essentially, my father came back, and it was very, very high alert. And for some strange reason, he had never done this his entire tour, but he told Cahey, he said, let's dig a little pit next to the armored personnel carrier, and let's sleep in that. It'll be a little cool, we'll be protected, that kind of thing. That's what they did. My father went down underneath, and he heard a tremendous explosion. And essentially, the other 6 members of his squad were all in the armored personnel carrier. There was a machine gunner at top. Very rarely did they sit in the armored personnel carrier, but in this particular case, for some reason, they did. And an RPG attack came and blew the whole thing up, killing everyone instantly. Guy on the top on fire, he had fallen, and my father and Cahey got up. My father ran to the left, Cahey ran to the right, and they began to return fire. In a flash, my father lost everybody in his squad, and everyone was dead. And how they handle it in Vietnam is they don't. And he had lost 6 of his friends instantly. And more importantly, to my father, he lost his home. He had lost his home. And what was interesting is that night now there is a breach in the perimeter, which means that there is a place that the enemy can come in. So this battle is kind of going on and on and on, that kind of thing. Mortars are kind of going. And they assigned my father, the armored personnel carrier was on fire for most of the day, so it was hot. You couldn't get in to remove the bodies out of it. So basically, there's a kind of a hole, and my father's job was to sit next to the armored personnel carrier all night, facing with his gun, because there's no more machine gunner, in case the enemy comes. And my father talked about that he knows he shouldn't, but all night he would look out into the woods and look for them coming, and then he would look to his right in the open hole of the armored personnel carrier, and he would see the burned up remains of his friends. And he would see in a shadow, he would see an arm, a blackened flesh, and he would say, I'm not supposed to look in there. And he would look forward again, looking for the enemy. But then he would look to his right again, and he would look at the remains of his friends. And he did that for 10 or 12 hours. And that's how they dealt with things in Vietnam. And I asked, were you sad or anything like that? And the answer was no. He was immediately assigned to another squad. Cahey, his other squad member, was immediately assigned to another squad, and they never spoke of it again. It was as if it had never happened. And that's just kind of how things were. This is it here burning in the background. There's my dad right there. That's basically him in the back kind of talking. This is him in his home, living in his little armored personnel thing. That's them walking on a patrol. That's my dad, a little guy, happy. Probably before December 16th. My father basically, again, he'd done it, when my father, he was drafted, he did his first tour in Korea, and he kept volunteering to go to Vietnam. He was hearing about Vietnam, and he thought how cool it would be to go to Vietnam, and that's what he did. He said, I want to go to Vietnam. They denied him twice. Eventually, they approved, and he went to Vietnam. He arrived, landed, thought it was the worst decision of his life, but one you can't undo. And he did a year in Vietnam. My father was skinny like me. He was a little tunnel. They assigned him the job of a tunnel rat. There's actually real training to be a tunnel rat. In most of the guys that were combat infantry, they just picked a skinny guy and said, go down in the tunnels. The tunnels were pretty fascinating. They were little, and you could kind of crawl in there. My dad thought, hey, I'm 19 or 20. It's kind of a cool thing to do. And the first time he did it, they tied a little rope around him, and my father thought, well, that's pretty nice to find my way back. And it wasn't until later that he realized it wasn't for that. It was if he goes down there and they shoot him and kill him so that they could pull the body back out. And my father said it was kind of nerve-wracking going down there because if it curved, they could kind of shoot around you, but he never encountered any enemy, and what he really liked most is if he got to the end, there was usually a little room with little papers. It was a little dirt room, but it was cool, and it was quiet, and it was dark, and in the hell that was Vietnam, it was a nice little escape. So for 20 minutes or so, he could kind of hide. When my father left Vietnam, again, he didn't speak of anything, and he would sit in a bar alone. I hear stories of my father. He would be in the bar drinking, and he would either be fighting or crying. That was kind of his thing. He met and married my mother. He met her in a bar. They married, and he did that because that's what you're supposed to do. And then he had 2 kids, myself and my brother, because that's what you're supposed to do. And he got a job at like a local steel mill because that's what you're supposed to do. And he got a house because that's what you're supposed to do. And my father was fine. My father drank and drank and drank and was an active alcoholic, and his marriage, like almost everybody I talked to, lasted all of about 5-6 years. And I'm pretty sure my mother probably shouted all the time, why won't you just talk to me? It's like you don't even care. All my father's medals went into a little shoebox, and they got tucked away into a corner. And my father hung his military uniform up into a closet, and then one day he threw it away. Vietnam no longer existed for my father. He didn't speak of it. It just went away. And he compartmentalized everything. And then something happened. My uncle had heard that they were going to have a parade. This is a big deal back then in 1986 in Chicago. They had a welcome home parade. Up until then, Vietnam was looked upon rather negatively, and they had a big parade. And it was the first time my father was going to see other Vietnam veterans. He didn't want to go because, again, Vietnam didn't exist for him. First time in 20 years. So he decided to go, and it was a pretty emotional experience for him. And they had a little section over there of different squads and different areas and different, units and things like that. And there was one with his, and it had a name on there, Don Elvert. My father didn't remember his name or anything like that, and said, I know he was in there at the same time as me. Everybody has nicknames. I don't really know who he is. So my father, for the first time in 20 years, reached out to another combat veteran and wrote a letter and said, hey, I served during this time. And what's interesting is that Don wrote back and said, yeah, but I don't really remember you either. Why don't I send you a picture of myself so that maybe we could remember. And the picture that he sent back is this one. And Don Elvert is actually the guy who's the clinical psychologist. He is the guy on the machine gun. And in the back is my father. So Don sent back a picture of him standing next to my father. He said, oh, I remember you, and all that stuff. Don started to begin and implement the process of healing. Don had started his own recovery. He had started going to school as a counselor. He started working at Hazelden. And they all got together and decided to meet up all the war buddies. My father wasn't ready yet. My father hadn't quit drinking yet. My father was fine. And Don took him aside and said, you know what? We have a serious problem here. We got one of the guys here is in serious trouble. One of our guys needs some serious help, Dennis. And my father said, well, who? Well, Sergeant, who? And Don said, it's you. And my father said, I'm fine. And he blew it off for many, many years. Fine. This is a picture of Don and various other people that served down there. One of them is paralyzed from the waist down. He was paralyzed. He was a doctor or a medic. Don is there. My father's the one with the hat. All 5 of them had alcohol and drug problems. Almost everybody I talked to all had they were alcohol and drugs. My father, about 5 years ago, decided that he was going to apply for PTSD and begin to see counseling and things like that. So he walked into the VA and he talked to the woman, and the psychiatrist who was there didn't ask him anything about Vietnam. He had all these papers and photos, and here's what happened, and here's this, and I lost all my buddies, and here's all the trauma. I've been wounded twice. I have a combat infantry badge. Here we are. And the woman asked him, how's your job? How are you doing? Have you ever been to rehab? No, everything's fine. And he was denied. And my father, which is really what instigated this whole thing, my father got so mad because by denying that, it was almost like they denied all of it. And he got so mad because all he wanted, he didn't care about the benefits, he didn't care about the money. He said, I just want you to acknowledge that what happened to me was serious. And it was like it wasn't. So my father began to fight, and he started seeing a therapist, which is when he started opening up to me. And eventually, about 2.5 years later, he was actually accepted. They accepted his PTSD benefits. What my father did after that is he pulled out his little medals and he hangs them on a little wall. This is kind of his little medals. And every December 16th, where he used to get into kind of a deep, dark depression, he takes the monies that he gets for his for disability and PTSD, and he gives it to friends and families and people that are struggling. Because he thought, you know what? For 50 years, December 16th was the worst day of my life. Maybe if I help other people on December 16th, it won't be so bad. So that's kind of my dad's thing. We're going to go back there. Let's go back to December 16th, and a strange thing happened because my father and Kahi were the only ones that lived. There was the guy that got blown off on the top, and my father about 3 years ago discovered that the machine gunner who was on the top that had caught on fire actually survived, and we were able to talk to him. His name is Private Bob Drake. Private Bob Drake's Vietnam tour lasted all of 28 days. This is him. He was a high school dropout, didn't have much going on, so he thought going to Vietnam was a pretty cool deal. And that's him actually going up the escalator. The thing that surprised him the most was the sheer number of Vietnamese people that he saw all over the place that were supposedly friendly. They told him, stay away from Vietnamese women, stay away from the Vietnamese, don't trust the Vietnamese, and everywhere he looked, there were Vietnamese people, South Vietnamese. He arrived there, he got a little bit of a refresher course. This is actually a menu from that time. I thought it was kind of interesting, Thanksgiving Day menu. So I guess Vietnam wasn't that bad. We got kind of a little Thanksgiving dinner, and he had his little Thanksgiving dinner and did his little refresher thing, and they plopped him in the middle of the perimeter, and Bob was sitting on top of the armored personnel carrier. His job for that day was the machine gunner during the day. When the RPG hit, he was engulfed in flames, and he was caught on fire. He was thrown out of the armored personnel carrier, and he landed completely on fire. His hands were on fire, and he took his hands at that time and started rolling and rolling to put himself out. And he took his hands that were on fire to put them out, and he put them underneath his armpits. And he held them there for a while until the fire went out. And when he pulled them out, his hands, the skin off of his hands inverted inside out and were hanging by his fingertips. Medics came up to him, and the first one that saw him fainted. The second one shot him up full of morphine. An ironic thing that happened, there was a short round, which is a mortar round that was supposed to go outside the perimeter and hit the enemy, actually didn't and landed next to him. He thought, oh, that's a crappy day. It did not go off. He was whisked away and taken to Japan that day. They notified everyone that he was dead. They thought he was dead. Everyone in the squad thought he was dead. And he was whisked away by a helicopter. He doesn't remember much. It was 2 or 3 days. This is actually a Western Union telegram that they sent on December 16th to his parents. And it basically says, can't even read that there. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas S. Drake, don't phone. The Secretary of the Army has asked me to express his deep regret that your son, Private First Class Robert H. Drake, was placed on the very seriously ill list in Vietnam on 16 December, result of a 3rd-degree burns to his hands and 2nd degree to his knees, arms, neck, and face. It's in forward base camp standing behind a military vehicle. He was actually on top of it. When the vehicle was hit by hostile automatic weapons fire, small arms fire, and anti-tank round, in the judgment of the attending physician, his condition is of such severity that there is cause for concern. A friend of the family actually worked the Western Union and received that telegram and rushed it over to his parents. A couple days later, they got another Western Union that said he'd been upgraded from very serious to just serious. A few days later, he was upgraded into good, and they basically notified that he'd fly to a hospital in Texas. And that's where he went. He spent several months in rehabilitation. His tour was 28 days. He had seen all of about a few days of combat, burned over most of his body. And basically, while he was there, they put him in what's called a striker bed. Striker bed back then, and understand that, the advances of the time, they learned a lot about wounds and burns and things like that. A striker bed basically closes on you and allows them to flip you upside down so you can remove the sheets. He said the worst part of that process was they would debride him, which means they'd put him in a tank and they would scrape off all the dead skin every single day. It was excruciating pain. Did it for several months, and I would ask him, well, did you see a therapist? Did you see? No. There was no therapist. It was there was a lot of gallows humor. There was one particular time that he started getting down on himself. Look at me, no one will marry me. Look at what a pathetic, look at me, why me? And basically one of the officers there gave him the riot act. Why you? You're one of the lucky ones, that kind of thing. And he shut up about it. And the military, their way of processing things is shut up about it and tough it out. And that's what Bob did. Bob became an alcoholic. And ironically, after he got better, Bob re-enlisted and wanted to serve for more time, and Bob did about 8 more years in the military. But you have to understand, Bob did 28 days in Vietnam. He was not going to back to Vietnam. Because of the nature of his burns, he was ordered to not do any KP duty, which is washing and stuff like that. He couldn't be in the sunlight. He couldn't go back to Vietnam, so he got a pretty cool desk job. And Bob took his injuries and took his experiences in Vietnam, and he never bought a drink again. And he loved it. And he admits that he rode that and was quick to tell everyone about his injuries. And he was kind of like a hero, because most people that served in Vietnam didn't have combat in Vietnam. And here he was for the next 8 years, wounded, covered in burns, all that stuff, nearly crippled, with a great story. And he rode that story out. But his relationships were impaired. Alcoholism increased. He has 3 failed marriages, I believe. Disconnection. Bob eventually did get sober, got into recovery, and today Bob is actually a forest ranger on the East Coast, and he wanders around the woods and points out things and all that stuff. And that's his grandchild right there. So we'll go back to December 16th. There was Cahey, and actually this presentation is all directly as a result of Sergeant Cahey. Sergeant Cahey was the last person that my father was trying to reach and never had. And I made a deal with my father, and I said, I'm kind of a computer nerd, and I have a private eye friend, and I said, if I find him, I want to make the journey with you. And I want to meet this Mr. Cahey, the man that my father claims is his best friend from Vietnam that he hasn't talked to in 50 years. And I said, I'll make you the deal, because I kind of figured how the story was going to end. We would meet Cahey, the healing would begin, because my father had done that for a few of his buddies so far. And I found Cahey. And the story with Cahey, there's Cahey. Cahey was actually from Mississippi, and going into the military was probably a step up for him. Very, very poor. And what was interesting is that my father said, in their company there was no racism. He said, we didn't look at black as black or white as white. We were all in this together. It was the great equalizer. He said, if we could have kept that and brought that to the world, it would have been a wonderful thing. And so this was my father's best friend, Sergeant James P. Cahey. And my father, basically, he and Cahey went into the hole together, and the explosion happened, and Cahey went to the right, my father went to the left. My father says that that is the moment that their lives divided. And my father, by going left, got one life, and Cahey, by going to the right, got another life. Basically, when the explosion happened, Cahey took off, and they never talked about it again. We did find Mr. Cahey. This is the last known address of Mr. Cahey. If you look through those woods, you can see a small shack that's pretty much abandoned. We wrote to Mr. Cahey, and Mr. Cahey did write back. He said, hello, Dennis. Man, how are you doing? It's good to hear from you and the other guys. It's been quite a while since we heard from each other. In fact, I was thinking about you guys some time ago. I still got the pictures and letters in a photo album. I got one of the squad, Alfred, Bird, Worm, everybody. There was one new guy that probably came in after I left. Hope you guys are doing well. Sometimes I just go get the album and I look through it, and the old memories return to the good times we had and the close calls we had. At times I drift back too far. Don't want to be bothersome. A lot of things have happened since then. I got married for about 2 years, and then she left. Tried to work things out. There'd be times when I would fall apart. I began having flashbacks. I started drinking heavy, trying to cope with it alone. This was off and on. I straighten up for a while. When I get depressed, I start up again. But all the things that I suppressed in my mind finally caught up with me. Started having nightmares, sometimes twice a week. I had to try and get some help from the VA, but they're trying to give me the runaround. After all these years, the chickens have come home to roost. Future don't look too bright, but like the old coat in the closet, I'm hanging in there and trying to make it every day. I was surprised that you knew where to write. First, I thought it was one of those postcard mailings. I've got a lot of them, but then I saw your name and said I knew a Dennis Lee in Vietnam, and I opened it. And I thank you guys for sending the Christmas card. I really appreciate it. And the phone number you have for me is correct, but I have a track phone, and I have to buy my minutes and add them. And at this time, I don't have any money or anything on it. Things have been really tight, but as soon as I get some money, I'll call, and we can talk for a while. We kept writing back and forth, my father did to Mr. K. The idea was we would go, and my father was going to go help him. And in back and forth letters, my father made several trips down to Mississippi to go visit, and Mr. K, he wouldn't show. We've probably figured out that he's probably homeless. He does have a track phone, which kind of shows his situation, and talking to some of the people. And my father has done everything from, I'll pay for you to get here, I'll do everything to get here. And Mr. Hayes says, that sounds like a great idea, but not today. Next week, next week, next week. And I thought things were going to end differently. I thought we would meet Mr. Cahey, and all the healing that I had heard from all the wonderful guys and things like that would begin. And unfortunately for Mr. Cahey, that is probably not the case. And he's probably the reason why I did this whole thing. And I think about Mr. Cahey, and I think about what happened on December 16th, and what happened to a lot of the guys that were in Vietnam. And it's not like they're any less human or anything like that, but in every single case, it's like there was a piece of them that stayed there. And I think about Mr. Poor Little Cahey, and I hope that one day my father gets to sit face to face, because there's one thing that I know to be true, just like in AA and other things, is there's no greater good than one Vietnam veteran helping another. Because when they sit together, they know whether they met each other or not. Clinicians are wonderful, therapy is awesome, but there is magic when two Vietnam veterans sit together and begin to talk. A couple of the other people that I talked about, Dr. Don Elbert, he is, again, a clinical psychologist at Hazelden. He did go back to Vietnam. He was the guy that had 20 years of nightmares. He always had the same nightmare and the same dream. He got into recovery, the dreams went away, and he went over to Vietnam. He has a Vietnamese girlfriend, ironically, and he went over to Vietnam to go and see where all the battles were. And strangely enough, there's a park where he saw the worst of it, where he was overrun. And that night when he went to sleep, he had the same nightmare that he used to have years before. He hadn't had it in years. And the nightmare goes like this. He's sitting there in the listening post, which is 3 guys sitting there, and he's asleep. And it's night, and he's asleep, and he can hear the boots coming. And he's opening his eyes, but he can't move, and he can't wake himself up, and he can't wake himself up. And the guys are coming with their guns, and they're going to shoot him, and he feels helpless and paralyzed, and he can't get out. And he had that same dream, and what was really interesting is his girlfriend, who is very spiritual, and they're into ghosts and spirits, his Vietnamese girlfriend woke up and she said, "Boy, I just had the strangest dream. I dreamed that you were sleeping in the woods, and some soldiers were coming up to you, and they were about to shoot you." And if this was Hollywood, the story would be different. After so and so many years, after recovery, he would go out to Vietnam, he would process and he would heal, and he would have the same dream, but in this dream, the soldiers would say, "You can go now." But that's not what happened in this dream. He had the exact same dream, because there's probably a part of Dr. Don Albert, who has done so much therapy and work and help, that is still in Vietnam, 19 years old, scared to death, on a listening post somewhere. And the thing that I learned about all these guys is there is a piece of them that'll always be in Vietnam. A piece of them. And the most interesting thing that I learned about the people in Vietnam was the diminished emotional range that they had. When I began to talk to my dad a little bit about things about fear and stuff like that, and different relationships and all that stuff, in every single person that I talked to, the number one, the most impacting thing that happened to them is they now all have an inability to have an intimate and true relationship with another human being, which is why their marriages fail. It's why they're disconnected, et cetera. And I would talk to my dad about things like that. I'm like, "Well, tell me about a time that you experienced grief." And I asked all these guys that, "Tell me about when you experienced grief." And he said, "Well, I really haven't." And I said, "Well, what about when your father died?" "Well, he was getting up in years, and it was kind of time he was ready." And I said, "Well, what about when, Mom left you?" "Well, we talked about it, and it was probably the best for you kids." And things like that. And every single person that I talk to, that's exactly how their life is. There's one gentleman that I talked to, his dog just passed away about 2 or 3 weeks ago. A dog about 15 years, and he has been crying in a chair 24 hours a day because he lost his dog. And the reality is, if his wife passes away or his children pass away, he will show up at the funeral and he will say all the right things because that's what he's supposed to do. And he'll say, "Well, I guess that's that." And he'll probably go play golf. And he probably won't shed a single tear. And that's how most of the guys that I met were. That they were fine, but they weren't fine. And the thing that's interesting is that a lot of the people that are coming back from Afghanistan and things like that are coming back, sure, the suicide rates are going up. There's going to be alcohol. There's going to be drinking. There's going to be a lot of problems. There's going to be a lot of the crazy stuff and all that stuff that's going to happen. But the thing that I worry the most about are the people that are fine. And the majority of the people that seen the most amount of combat over there are going to come back, and they're going to be fine. And they'll disconnect, and they'll be slightly aloof, and they won't be around such social gatherings, and they'll be fine. And they'll all be fine. And if they lose a friend, a funeral, they'll probably just say, "Well, I guess that's that." Brush themselves off and go play golf. And they'll internalize everything, and it will take them the next 50 or 60 years to get where my father and his friends have actually gotten. So I'm going to kind of end with, my dad gave me this once. He couldn't tell me what Vietnam was, so he gave me this little thing. And other people, for some reason, that went to Vietnam, it doesn't mean that much to him, but it meant something to my father. So I'm going to end with this. And it was written from a book, and it basically, he said, "This describes a lot about who I am." And it says, "Perhaps it was the luxuries of the world which we exchanged for the harshness of the jungle that made us so violent against the enemy. Pilots killed from the air with napalm and bombs, and they returned to air-conditioned clubs to talk of flying rather than destruction. Artillerymen scrambled to man their guns to fire missions that rained death on an unseen enemy, and they returned to half-eaten meals to complain that the food had grown cold. But infantrymen removed gold teeth and occasionally ears or more from the bodies of young men and women who surely must have thought their cause at least as just as we thought ours. Yet I, like the others, expressed no regret nor remorse, except about not being able to kill and destroy even more. I do not know why we were the way that we were. The standard justifications that we were fighting for the survival of our comrades and ourselves was true, but we went beyond the means of self-protection with a bloodlust that no American mother would recognize nor acknowledge in her son. I never knew a man who admitted liking the war, yet none of us ever seemed to live as intensely as when we were trying to kill our fellow man on this planet. It's been an absolute honor to give this presentation. I just wanted to give kind of a different human aspect on what happened to the lives of a few different people and how their lives drastically changed, and to put perhaps a different view on PTSD, that, you know, those that need the help will probably find it, but those that mostly need the help probably won't. And it's those that I think about and I worry about. Again, Vietnam was probably the single most important thing that happened in my life, and yet it didn't exist in my house. And for many of the servicemen, Afghanistan will not exist in their house. Iraq will not exist in their house. And they'll be sitting in a chair fine. So that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for this opportunity.